Freedom Synergy.
Hey guys, hello gorgeous. Big honor for me today. I am talking to another vintage, no that's not how I want to start, vintage.
That's about right.
That's the problem is I talk about vintage toys so much, it's like part of my regular vocabulary now. Huge honor for me today. I'm going to be talking to another writer from a bunch of my favorite Sunbow shows from the 80s. A lot of you heard the interview with Buzz Dixon a while ago. Great chat with him. And I'm so honored and thankful to Christy Marx joining me on the show today for a chat. Christy, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, and hello from Northern California.
So Eric Lutz actually got me in touch with you, and I do cartoon commentaries on the show here, and Jem was one of his suggestions because he used to watch Jem with his sister. And he had mentioned that he knew you and recommended a chat. And so we did a cartoon commentary, my wife and I and Eric, and had a great time watching some of your old work. And want to talk to you about a whole bunch of stuff that you worked on. But let's start out with Jem. You're the creator of Jem and the Holograms, right?
Well, let me be very specific. I'm the creator of the animation series.
Right.
Because there was a toy designer named Bill Sanders who came up with the underlying fundamental concept. And then he partnered up with a couple of other toy designers who took it to Hasbro. Hasbro took it from a boy toy design and made it a girl toy design. And then they designed a line of dolls.
So that's something I am not aware of. Never heard that before. It was originally conceived to be a boy's toy.
Right.
Called Jem and the Holograms. About.
Well, no, it was not necessarily called that.
Oh,
but
okay. It was maybe a bunch of guys, maybe Zartan and Cold Slither, something like that, maybe, like punk rockers.
I don't. There isn't a lot of information about this, and what I know is stuff that I dug out that's incredibly obscure. But I do know that his original concept was for a male band. Okay,
and what was the reasoning? Do you know? Behind changing it to focusing more on girls, because similarly they did that with He-Man, right? They shifted to She-Ra and changed the audience over to the girls.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what Hasbro's reasoning was. It probably was just that they didn't need another boy line, but maybe they did need a good line of fashion dolls for girls. I think maybe they saw themselves as competing with Barbie or something like that. Mm-hmm. That would be my best guess.
I remember watching the show as a kid because, like, back in the day, we didn't have the freedom to just watch and binge whatever we wanted to. Today, everybody is their own programmer, television programmer. But back in the day, you watched what was on. And if you wanted to watch Transformers, well, sometimes there was an episode of Jem right before it. So I went, well, why not? And I dug it. I liked the show. But being an avid toy collector back then, too, I did notice... because when you're wandering through Toys R Us for quite a while, sometimes you wander through the girl section too. And I did notice, hey, why don't these Jem dolls look anything like they do on the show?
Yeah, right. Well, when I first started working on it, there's another piece of this, which is that at the time Hasbro was doing G.I. Joe, and they were doing all of this, they were funding this animation for their toy lines, and they did it through a company called Sunbow Productions, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
And so I had been writing G.I. Joe episodes, and they really liked my episodes. So when they got the job from Hasbro to create an animation series based on this new Jem toy line, which was not called Jem, by the way.
Do you remember what the original?
They came to me to do the development work. And so I ended up coming up with, they had prototypes of the actual dolls, and they had some product names, which kept changing all the time, by the way.
Yeah.
So I think the only two characters whose names did not change were Rio and Pizzazz. Ah. And every other doll had a different name when we started out. And originally, Jem was just called M.
Ah.
Just the letter M. But then they realized that that was legally problematic.
And so when they hired you to work on this television show, I'm always curious to hear how much freedom or lack of freedom does the writer have when they're working for a big company with, you know, at the end of the day, they're trying to sell toys. What I love about the 80s cartoons is it felt to me like the writers were trying to do more than just sell toys. They wanted to tell good stories with good morals to them. But how much freedom did you have on the creation of the concept behind the show and the characters?
Well, first let me say that neither I nor anyone I ever worked with in animation was trying to sell toys. We were storytellers, and our first concern was, as you said, telling good stories with interesting characters.
That was my hunch.
Yeah. I mean, we did not sit around and say, oh, how are we going to sell toys at all? That was of no concern to us whatsoever. We were just about creating really great stories. And actually, I was quite fortunate. I worked with Sunbow. I had almost no contact with Hasbro, very, very, very little. Everything I did through Jay Bacall and Joe Bacall and the guys at Sunbow. And I actually had quite a lot of freedom. I had the underlying concept, which was rock and roll, good girl band, bad girl band. These number of characters. Here's the product names for the characters. So M became Gem, and she started out as, what was her first name? First name was like Misty or Morgan, and then she became Jerica. And so there were the basic characters. The only relationships they had in mind were that Rio was a boyfriend and Kimber was her sister. And then they had some basic toy stuff that they wanted, like the Rock and Roadster and so forth. They wanted that introduced. But other than that, they basically left everything to me. So I got to actually create who the characters were, their full names. The whole Starlight Foundation, Starlight Girls, all came from me. Eric Raymond came from me, who was named in honor of my brother.
Oh, that's nice.
And so the whole basic setup and all of the character development, everything came from me. And I had a tremendous amount of freedom. There was very, very little direction, or there's a little bit of direction, obviously, but for the most part, I would say I had a tremendous amount of freedom when I was creating the series.
Sounds like a dream come true.
Yeah, very unusual.
Because a lot of on the other shows, there'd be edicts like you need to put in the Awe Striker or the Mobat, or you need to have at least 7 minutes of the Rocket Roadster. That's, you never want to be constrained like that. But
yeah, G.I. Joe, when they handed out, they would hand out sheets that said, okay, for this particular episode, we want you to use these characters and these particular vehicles, or, some special object. And then your job was to come up with a really cool story in which those could be utilized, and, using those characters. Gem, we did not do that. The only real specific guidance for Gem, once we got into the regular half-hour series, were the songs. You had to have one song per act, and it had to be, some Gem song, some Misfit song. And then later on, in order to save money, they wanted to start reusing songs. And so later on in the series, we ended up having to say, okay, you have to reuse at least, 2 previous songs per episode or whatever.
And I love those songs. During the commentary, we talked about how I love how it just kind of pops up and it's a thing unto itself, where the imagination runs wild. There's even an MTV style credit that pops up telling you that what the name of the song is, even though it's a minute long.
Well, this was the height of the MTV era. This is when MTV was really the hot, big new thing.
And we noticed during that episode that the Misfits, and my wife also commented on the rest of the show, the Misfits songs were always better. Like it was, the song was true. We are the Misfits. Our songs are better. So was there a little bit of trepidation about making the songs for the Misfits better, even though they were the not as moral singers, bad influences?
Well, I'm not sure everyone would agree with you that necessarily that their songs were better, but there are Misfits fans and there are Gem fans, and what can I say? But no, what I would do and what the writers would do is we would include about, a paragraph within the script of what the song was about, what it covered, and maybe a suggestion of some of the images. The lyrics and the composing were done in New York.
So with the casting of the actual performer of Jem, there's two different voice actresses, right? The one that played Jerrica and I guess the speaking voice of Jem, and then a different actress was cast for the singing parts of Jem?
Yeah, exactly. You had Britta Phillips doing the singing, and you had Samantha Newark doing the voice, and which is really ironic because Sam is this wonderful singer.
Right, right.
She's a fabulous singer, and she's still out there producing albums and going to all the Jem conventions, and she's just absolutely a sweetheart. She's wonderful.
Yeah, she just did one recently in my area, too, in Mississauga. So I thought that was kind of funny, too, how you had the voice actress doing the singing part, and well, they can do both, but it's just kind of funny how that was inverted. When you were writing the stories, did you have also the freedom to basically write episodes that flowed into each other? Because back then, whether it was animation or live action like A-Team or Magnum P.I., they were usually standalone episodes that didn't flow into each other unless it was a special occasion part 1 part 2 type of thing. But with Jem, it feels like the episodes kind of flow into each other like an ongoing story.
Well, let me back up a little bit and talk about the origin of Jem, because when I was first hired to write this material, we were not doing half-hour episodes. There was a show. That's right. It was either called Super Saturday or Super Sunday, depending on what day it aired in a particular market. Mm-hmm. And there were 3 segments in each half hour, and Jem was in the middle. So there was a boy action segment. That was the first one. The second one was Jem, and then the third one was another boy action segment. I can never quite remember what was sandwiched around it, and it changed. But
Humanoids.
Humanoids and something else. Yeah.
One of my
favorites. So the original were 15 short segments. They were, I think, maybe 9 minutes or something like that. And the big concern is that, yes, it had to have the romance and the fashion and the glitter and all the stuff that they wanted for Jem, but it had to have enough hard action and cliffhangers so that the boys would not change the dial. That was their big concern. They thought the boys controlled the channel dial, which at the time was more manual, and they were terrified that the boys would get to the Jem segment and they'd change away from the show. And so the original 15 segments were all designed sort of like the old-fashioned serial, where there was always this big cliffhanger. Mm-hmm. And so it created this particular pattern that we ended up following for Jem. And then they took those 15 segments and turned them into the first half hours. And we had to write some additional material, in fact, because they weren't quite long enough when you put them together that way. So you might notice the number of really hard cliffhangers that occur in those first episodes. And then after that, they did give me the freedom to do a number of 2-parters and 3-parters so that we could have a bigger arc. And they weren't afraid of doing that. But also they were doing 65 half hours. They were doing full syndication runs, which at the time were the 65 half hours. Mm-hmm. So they had more freedom and more flexibility to do that.
Mm-hmm. And Jem was much more successful than some of the other more obscure Hasbro toy lines, like in Humanoids and Visionaries had very short runs, something like 12, 13 episodes, whereas Jem, actually one of the more successful Sunbow runs, 3 seasons it looks like. So they would
Unfortunately, the toy did not do well enough for them, though. The dolls didn't sell well enough to satisfy them. And so when we got close to the end of the 65, we got the word that they weren't going to be continuing it.
Well, that's because they didn't look anything like the characters on the show. and I know sometimes when they create these things, they create them so far in advance that sometimes different departments don't communicate with each other properly. But I specifically remember the Jem doll not having pink hair, maybe having a pink wisp, and thinking that's not good for the girls who really want a Jem doll.
I don't know an awful lot about the doll end of things, although I go to the Jem conventions, and there are some fanatic doll collectors and there, of course. But one thing I have heard is that they made the Gem doll bigger than the Barbie doll. She was actually a larger size.
Bigger is better, right?
But what it meant was girls who had, say, a bunch of Barbie fashions and clothing could not use them on the Gem doll, and vice versa.
Yeah.
So it wasn't a very good use of a parent's money, and they'd have to buy a doll that was a different size and some other doll, and not be able to use the same fashions between the dolls and what have you.
Yeah, it's something I remember as a kid wishing that toy lines were more compatible with each other, but it seemed like every single toy line, even ones by the same company like Hasbro, they weren't compatible with each other. That might have helped with the success of the toy line, but I noticed now there's a company called Integrity doing some really high-end stuff for Gem. And I don't know.
Yeah, they're doing this. They're doing like super expensive collector dolls.
Yeah, they look amazing.
They're not toys. they're like these. I have one that they sent me after they brought out all these various dolls, and I thought, well, they brought out one from a character that I created, Countess du Voisin, and so they sent me one of those dolls.
Yeah, you might want to hang on to that. Maybe if you ever have trouble paying the bills, put it up on eBay. That'll help you, because those things run for quite a bit. I'd love to get just a regular classic Gem for my wife, but I'm a collector of some of these Japanese, they're called Hot Toys, 12-inch figures that are high-end, very detailed, but the Integrity stuff, I think there's one classic Gem doll on eBay going for $500 now. I think one sold for $1,000 a while ago. So
the only Gem doll I ever had was one that my mother bought me. When the show first went on the air, my mother was so thrilled, so she went out and bought me one of the original Gem dolls. I never got any dolls from Hasbro, not a single one. So I had that one, but I recently moved.
They probably thought because you get to play with Gem every day, like the real Gem, they thought you're good, you're covered, right?
Nah, I think they just didn't think about it at all, really.
Yeah.
But other shows that I wrote for, including shows from Hasbro, they would send me the action figures of the dolls, like Conan. I got those, and some other stuff, some He-Man stuff, and some various other toys and so forth. But we recently just moved. My husband and I bought a house, and it's quite a small house. So when we moved, I sold all of my toy collection, everything, to the Strong Museum of Play in New York.
That's cool.
I had been negotiating with them for quite a long time about they're going to be getting all of my papers and so forth eventually. So they're going to have an entire collection in my name at the Strong Museum. So rather than just having to move boxes and boxes of these things, which I had no room for, they went to the Strong Museum.
So when you approached writing Gem, is that you have to basically write the story out over 65 episodes? Do you make it up as you go along? Like, do you have an idea of where you want the story to eventually go? And did you get to wrap things up the way you wanted to?
Yeah, Gem, we didn't worry about trying to do any kind of a larger arc over 65 episodes. And also, we kind of had seasons. They weren't really technically seasons, but I tend to think of them as seasons because we started out with the original Gem characters and Misfits characters, and then they got into another toy season where they wanted to add new dolls. And so that's where we ended up with adding Rhea, adding Jeddah. And then we had the Stingers, and so they would add new characters. And consequently, that would guide a lot of what we would be doing for that, quote, season, unquote, because we would be adding the new characters. But basically, we would just come up with concepts, pitch premises to Jay Bacall, and then decide what we were going to do.
And I would be remiss if I didn't bring up Hector Ramirez, who is the Sunbow crossover character, the reporter, who appeared in so many of those shows like G.I. Joe, Transformers, and I think you gave him quite a bit more to do on Gem than he was basically a pest on the other shows. Well,
I didn't. I knew nothing about that character.
Oh.
Well, I was so busy developing and writing that I didn't do any story editing at first. So Roger Slifer was story editing all of the other episodes that I didn't write. And so Roger probably brought in that character or used that character because he would have been more familiar with it than I was. Mm-hmm. So I did about 22, I think it was, episodes myself. And then Roger edited most of the other episodes. And then towards the end of the series, I pushed to also do some story editing. So right towards the very end, I was story editing some of them.
Now, you said earlier that it wasn't important to you at all. The thought never crossed your mind and a lot of the writers' minds of selling toys. How important was it to you to tell important moral lessons, teach moral lessons to children? Because even in the first episode I just recently rewatched, there's a lot of good advice there for young people.
Well, it certainly wasn't a matter of saying, oh, I'm going to teach this moral lesson. It was just a matter of, I'm going to tell this good story, and here's what I feel like having my character say. And I don't believe in writing down to kids or talking down to kids, and I don't believe in preaching or moralizing. I just believe in telling a good story with characters that have something to say.
And then a couple years ago, Jem got brought back as a live-action movie, and I see here that you got to play Lindsay. So how was that?
Well, it was fun. I mean, I began my career working in television production, and I love being on sets. It's one of my favorite things. And so it was fun just to do that. And they treated me like royalty. They treated me very, very well on the set. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that I was pretty upset about how the whole movie thing happened, because I had been trying for a long time to try to get Hasbro to do something else with Jem. And I had been basically knocking at their door and getting nowhere. And I knew nothing about the movie at all until about the day before they announced it. Someone from Hasbro's PR department got in touch with me to kind of give me a heads up so that I wouldn't be completely blindsided.
Yeah, that's one.
And I was not happy about the direction that it took. But I was contacted by John Chu, the director, and we had a very nice phone conversation. He was trying to smooth my ruffled feathers to some degree, but also he wanted to talk to me about the show. And then he flew me to L.A. and we met up over a lunch, and he showed me his whole pitch and what he was trying to accomplish with it. And he was very sincere and passionate about it. It was something he genuinely cared about. And although I didn't agree with the direction they took in terms of the reboot, nonetheless, I really like John Chu a lot, and so when he asked me to do the cameo, I agreed to do it.
Yeah, it's important for everybody to compartmentalize, to not think black and white, to think gray. And I always say that, look, I may not have liked this person's work, but I appreciate them as a human being. It's nothing personal. But is there anything specific that you can go into, or do you want to just not talk about the movie?
It's not that it was a bad movie. It just wasn't Jem.
Yeah.
It was like Jem in name only. Yeah. It didn't truly capture, I think, what made Jem be Jem. And I think a lot of that may have come from Hasbro, because there was a word that kept coming up, the word grounded. And I had this feeling that they just didn't understand the audience, and they didn't understand. They made it too much about what they thought was new and trendy, which was social media, and not enough about the heart of Jem.
Yeah.
And I think they lost a couple of really significant elements. And the whole idea that Rio is now suddenly the owner of a company. I mean, the whole point of the animation series was that Jerrica ran the music company. It was hers. He got it from her father, and it was hers, and she was taking it over and making it work. And now all of a sudden, that's just gone.
Yeah.
That element's gone.
My wife was very excited about that as well, and I was excited for her. And when it came out, we didn't actually watch it, but I did quite a bit of research on it. I heard, I tried to read as many positive reviews as negative, but just from what I read about it and a lot of the clips I've watched about it, we both took away the feeling of this isn't Jem. Why did they change so much? And one word I use a lot when I'm talking about all of the things that I love from the 80s is soul. And some people look at me kind of sideways and they give me a funny look and like, what are you talking about, soul? And I don't know. I just feel things, you know, it's not just about watching it, hearing it, it's about feeling it. And I feel like so many of those shows back in the 80s they were cool, they looked cool, they were funny, they were witty, but they had soul. And I felt like when you do that to Jem, when you take away all of the gimmicks, you change everything except the names. You took the soul away, and someone who's making these decisions just doesn't seem to get it. That, look, it's not okay to keep the names and change everything else, to change the looks, change the motivations, the spirit of the character. That's not cool. And I've seen that happen time and time again with G.I. Joe. They changed everything except the names. Transformers, they changed everything except the names. And I just feel like this is soulless, and that's why it's not connecting anymore.
I can't really disagree with you on that. and I think that John did the best he could under really difficult circumstances, but I also think that I think just too much of the essence was lost. Mm-hmm. And it was if it had just been a nice little movie about, you know, a girl trying to make it through social media as a rock star, that would have been fine. Mm-hmm. You know, that would have been fine as its own little movie. And it was only a $5 million movie.
Yeah.
And I know John was hoping that he'd be able to turn it into a series of movies and then maybe get into more of the elements that he hadn't been able to get into. But unfortunately, it just did not do well. Unfortunately.
What are you free to talk about what your idea was for your movie pitch?
I wanted to keep it essentially the same, but just update it.
Yeah.
You know, reboot it with some updated technology and take into account the way the music business had changed and so forth, but still keep it essentially the same.
Yeah, that's another thing that I'm noticing. The more reboots that I see that come out and fail to connect, I'm starting to realize this isn't necessarily the creator's fault or the people behind this reboot. Hey, let's reboot this. It might just be a sign of the times, because a lot of those things that I love from the 80s, it was the time. It was the fun spirit of the time seeping into everything. And now there's a different vibe in the air today. And I think it's seeping into everything, including all of these fun 80s things that they're trying to bring back. Like they bring back G.I. Joe and everything's black and they're wearing leather and it's not fun and colorful anymore. So I think it's just the times that, you know, the examples of things being brought back and being perfectly genuine and sincere and true to the original vision, kind of like Wonder Woman was just fearlessly sincere to and true to its original kind of vibe. Those are few and far between.
Yeah, that was wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
That was really nicely done.
And I'm really hoping with the G.I. Joe reboot coming out that this time, since they had their chance to do things, the word is badass, with the leather suits and, you know, the tough guys. I hope this time, since they're starting from scratch, they're going to go back to what you worked on in the 80s with Shipwreck and the sailor outfit and, you know, the exact same outfits and stuff. And that's the next topic I wanted to talk to you about, kind of going back in time now before Jem. But you wrote on G.I. Joe Real American Hero cartoon series.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I was also fortunate in that I wrote 5 episodes, and there were two of those which were 2-parters,
mm-hmm.
Which is somewhat unusual, and I loved being able to do the longer arcs.
When I was doing my research on you, because I knew you as the Jem person, right? The Jem writer, the creative force behind Jem, and I start looking through your IMDb and I go, oh my God, she wrote some of my favorite episodes of G.I. Joe. The Captives of Cobra 2-parter, the Synthoid Conspiracy 2-parter, and one of my absolute favorites, Countdown for Zartan. Those are some of my favorite episodes. So can you talk a little bit about your experience working on that one and how it compared to Jem?
Well, it was interesting that when I first started writing animation, I was writing for Spider-Man for Marvel Productions, Patty Freeling originally, and then Marvel Productions. And I grew up obsessed with comic books. So I grew up absolutely, completely obsessed and collecting comic books from a very early age. Totally into comics. Started out with DC, but then when I discovered Marvels, that was it. I was totally into Marvels. So for me, being able to write Spider-Man was a dream come true. It was just the most amazing thing for me.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was coming up off of the action adventure stuff that I really enjoyed writing. Then I got into writing for G.I. Joe, and I was working with Steve Gerber, the wonderful, absolutely delightful, talented, and amazing Steve Gerber. And he demanded that everybody who was writing for G.I. Joe had to write on a computer. And we're talking early days of computers here.
Mm-hmm. Early 80s.
Yeah, because the very first computer, I had to go out and buy a computer and learn how to use a computer in order to write for G.I. Joe, which I was more than willing to do because I was completely intrigued with computers. So the first computer that I had was a K-Pro 10. And the K-Pro 10, I wish I could describe it. It was just this gray metal box that included both the monitor, the little monitor, and the computer, and the keyboard would actually just clip to the front of the monitor, and the whole box, you could just carry this box around. Mm-hmm. It was like a 50-pound laptop, you know, it was like, and no color, of course, it was just
monochrome.
I think it was green text.
Yep.
And I was using a system called CPM. There was not even MS-DOS yet. MS-DOS hadn't even been invented yet. Yep. And that's what I had to learn to write on. It was the first hard drive, and I want you to prepare yourself because this had a whopping 10 megabyte hard drive.
That's a lot for that time.
It was amazing. So
it's almost bottomless.
So it was really interesting because I was writing this hard action stuff that I loved. I loved writing that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, having to learn how to write on a computer, how to use a modem, how to use a bulletin board system, which is like the precursor of anything mm-hmm. resembling email. So how we communicated back and forth. Thanks to Steve Gerber, I got into all of that stuff like incredibly early. Mm-hmm. And I just had a blast. And that was how I got to know, Buzz Dixon and Roger Slifer and, Flint Dilley and Joe Straczynski and all of us. We were all part of this group of people who were writing together at the time. On these shows, and Steve was just absolutely a wonderful mentor. He was a fantastic person. If I was having computer trouble, I would tend to write late at night, and Steve Gerber tended to be somewhat of an insomniac. So 2 in the morning, if I was having a computer problem, I would be calling Steve up, and he'd be helping me work things out.
That's awesome.
So there was a lot of camaraderie, and it was just a lot of fun, and that countdown for Zartan, so that was the first G.I. Joe script that I wrote. And Steve paid me an enormous compliment. He said, "This is the only script I've ever gotten that I didn't have to rewrite."
Wow.
So everybody loved that script when it came in, and that's what led to me getting to do these 2-parters.
It was so clever at the end. Like, there's so many episodes of G.I. Joe that had cleverness that you didn't normally see in a children's cartoon, but that one especially, the very end, I don't know if you remember, but because sometimes people just forget what they did 20, 30 years ago, but the ending with Gung-Ho setting his watch fast so Zartan would think that the bomb is about to explode. And it's just a simple little trick, but it had Zartan squealing and crying and screaming, let me out, here's where it is. And it's just,
it was the ultimate classic ticking bomb story. I mean, when you get right down to it.
Yeah. When you're working on these scripts, how much research do you have to do? Because this isn't just 4 or 5 characters that you need to know. Like on the other shows, G.I. Joe is this huge team, and then you got all of the Cobras as well. So is there some sort of a Bible that you go through, or? Oh God, yes. We had this monster Bible. I think it was pretty much all Larry Hama's stuff, if I remember correctly. It was a 3-ring binder that must have been, I don't know, 6 inches thick. It was just monstrous, and that was what we would go to learn about the characters and learn about the vehicles or the weapons or whatever. Did you watch any of the other episodes, or did you prefer to go in with a fresh frame of mind?
And I didn't have any episodes to watch at the time, I don't think. I wasn't aware of them at any rate.
Yeah, because Countdown for Zartan's one of the very earliest, so I don't know if while you were writing that one, the other ones would have even been finished there.
Not that I know of. And plus, and remember at the time, the only way for me to see episodes that were, say, in production is someone would have to send me a VHS tape. Mm-hmm. That's what happened with the Gem episodes, is they would have to send me VHS tapes.
Well, those are some awesome episodes. Some of my favorites. I do watch G.I. Joe I revisit it often, and I love it. And that camaraderie that you mentioned, now I know where it comes from because it's on the show, and it was behind the scenes too. And I kind of had that feeling, but it's cool to hear from you and from Buzz as well. Talking about how it was basically the G.I. Joe team behind the scenes as well. It wasn't these writers who were being tormented by the evil corporation Hasbro, who was sending down these ridiculous edicts.
No, not that I ever knew of.
Yeah, it's great to hear that you guys had fun working on it, and that fun translated. To contrast, a couple years later, they moved production of the G.I. Joe animated show over to Deke, and I see that you wrote a couple episodes for that as well. Do you remember? Yeah,
that was definitely not the same thing. I was not going to write those at all. For one thing, they didn't want to pay as much, and
that's right.
I wasn't a huge fan of Deke and the way they did things, but the person who was story editing it was another good friend of mine from the old days. And so I said, okay, I'll do a couple of them for you. Just do not tell anybody that I'm taking this crap money that you're paying.
Yeah,
and it was just not the same quality. There were far greater restrictions on those shows in terms of what you could do. It was not a great experience.
Yeah, when I talked to Buzz, he didn't beat around the bush, and he just said, "Deke, do it cheap." That's what it stood for.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, they gave me one episode they gave me to do had like a large number, I forget exactly, but it had a large number of primary characters that I had to use. It was like a squad or something like that. But they said, but you can only have like 10 voices total in the episode. I'm like, wait a minute. The squad alone accounts for maybe 8 voices.
Yeah.
What am I supposed to do if I can only have 10? So it's one of those kind of things where you just have to grit your teeth and figure out how you're going to make that work.
Yeah, and it wasn't just the animation studio that changed too. They didn't have access to that amazing Sunbow voice cast anymore either. And those guys, it could have been 5 guys sounding like 20 or 30 guys because they were just that talented. I chatted with...
Well, yeah, any voice actor does that when they contract. They're usually contracting for some number of voices, not rarely is it just one voice. It might be for, like, say, a lead character like Jem or something, but usually a voice actor will end up doing more than one voice.
Mm-hmm. And I also see that you worked on a live-action show, which not a lot of people remember, but it was a good one. Captain Power and the Soldiers of the Future by J. Michael Straczynski.
Exactly.
The man behind Babylon 5. And then I see later on you also did write for Babylon 5 as well.
Yes, and I also wrote for the later Twilight Zone series that Joe worked on.
Yeah, what was it like working with J. Michael Straczynski?
Well, Joe is a really terrific writer, and he demands a lot. He wants you to live up to a very high standard. We were very good buddies, and that was the reason that I got a chance to, well, not the only reason, but that was certainly one of the reasons I got to know him through the bulletin board system we were using. Mm-hmm. And so he gave me a shot at writing for Captain Power. And Joe has a tendency to map things out himself. Like when he was pitching Babylon 5, he had already mapped out the entire 5 seasons of Babylon 5. He knew where he wanted it to start and where he wanted it to end and what he wanted to have happen in between.
Yeah.
And so on Captain Power, he would hand out a one paragraph premise of what he wanted that particular episode to be about, and then say, go do this. And on Babylon 5, he did the same thing. He gave me a paragraph premise and said, okay, here's what I want this particular episode to be about. Twilight Zone, I did pitch him an original idea that I was lucky enough to sell and to do on that one.
Cat and Mouse?
And so, Cat and Mouse, yeah. And that was a lot of fun. So yeah, it was good stuff. It was good times. I really enjoyed working on Captain Power because even though it was supposed to be a kids show, Joe was doing it as pretty dark and serious science fiction.
Yeah, extremely
he
dark.
He was intent on that. So
it was basically
some good stuff.
It was basically Terminator, this post-apocalyptic future, and I still remember watching it as a kid and thinking, I had seen Terminator, probably at too young an age, but I remember thinking, this is not a kid's show. Like, they have the smiling children on the commercials for the toys, but this is dark and dreary with real serious situations. So, but I'm amazed. I'm amazed that we got away with it, and the only reason the series didn't continue was because of some guy who decided he was going to become a crusader against the toy. Because the toy, it was the first TV series that incorporated some computer graphic elements which interacted with the toy. So the child could aim the toy at the screen, and when the computer graphic elements came up on the screen, it would react with the toy. That you could shoot with the toy, and it would, I forget exactly what happened, but it made it seem like they were actually shooting something on the screen and having an effect. And this asshole decided to become a crusader against this toy, and so Mattel ended up canceling the series. We were already working on the second season. In fact, I had written a 5-parter for the second season. That would have been so cool. And but it all just went up in smoke, unfortunately. Do you still have that somewhere around? Because there seems
of course
to be
I do.
Quite an audience for there's quite an audience for stories that continue the good old shows.
I sell the scripts on my website.
Oh, you might want to. I don't know if there's an opportunity to release those someday, but on Amazon Kindle Worlds, Buzz Dixon recently wrote. It's basically classified as a fan fiction, where there's a. Are you familiar with Kindle Worlds?
No, I'm not.
So there's a number of different properties that you're allowed to play in that sandbox. You're allowed to write in this universe or that universe, and one of the franchises that you're allowed to write a story for on Kindle Worlds is G.I. Joe. So Buzz Dixon wrote himself a story. Now, there's a lot of G.I. Joe fans who have written stories and published them, and the deal is that the rights holders get a percentage and the writer gets a percentage too. So it's a way of actually putting something out legally and getting paid for it. But I just love
that's
that.
Interesting.
I love that Buzz Dixon, one of the guys who helped create G.I. Joe, said, "Hey, I'm playing in this sandbox I helped create." So that would be awesome if there was some sort of Captain Power Kindle Worlds or some other opportunity where people who worked on the show and feel like they didn't get a chance to wrap things up can do that.
Yeah, interesting. Well, the scripts, this 5-parter. These are scripts that I can sell, and that's, I figure they stand alone as they are. So if anybody's interested in reading what that would have been, they can certainly go to my website, which is just christymarx.com, and purchase it there.
And I see there's a whole number of other animated shows that you worked on as well. A lot of them 1 or 2 episodes, maybe a couple more than that, but really incredible experience. You worked on Turtles, Bucky O'Hare, Conan the Adventurer, Reboot, one of my favorite animated shows. Also, Shadow Raiders, War Planets.
That was a lot of fun too. Because again, one of the nice things about those shows, they were done by Mainframe up in Vancouver, Canada. Not only was it interesting because it was the first CG stuff, and they were doing some amazing CG work, but also it was the same sort of camaraderie. And I was working with my friends of mine, Len Wein and Marv Wolfman, and a bunch of really great people, and they were a lot of fun to do.
Yeah, now that you mention it, there is that feeling of that old Sunbow magic with those Mainframe shows. Just written again, seemingly on the surface a kid's show, but when you delve a little deeper, so much more intelligent and so much more heart and soul. And I just always think it's funny that Mainframe created Beast Wars and War Planets and weren't allowed to call them that in the country they created them in. They had to call them Beasties and Shadow Raiders because Canada
Yeah.
Forbid shows with the word war in the title. And then a whole bunch more, X-Men Evolution. Just, it's really impressive. And I don't know how you can keep all these different worlds straight, because each one has different rules, different characters. I just wonder, like, how much research do you have to do when you're hired for a job to familiarize yourself with the situation that you're being put into?
Yeah, I'm a big researcher. I will always do a lot of research for things that I work on. Now, Bucky O'Hare is a case where Bucky O'Hare was already a comic book created by Neil Adams. So basically, I just was able to I developed that series and was the story editor on that series. And so that was simple because all I had to do was work with Neil and read his books and base everything on his books. And that was fun. I enjoyed that a lot. Then I was hired to do the development for Conan, which was a very interesting challenge because this was going to be another 65 half-hour series, and they had all of these action figures that they were creating for Conan, and so there were not just Conan but also his group of friends. But I went and I read every single Robert E. Howard story. I decided I was going to go only to Robert E. Howard, not anybody, because there have been a lot of other Conan stories written, but I decided I was going to go back just to the original creator. Mm-hmm. So I went back and read all of Robert E. Howard's stuff and wrote a massive Bible with all of the basic information about the characters and the country, the land, the setting, Hyboria and all of that. And it was a real challenge because when they said to me they wanted to do a Conan animation series, I said, you do understand we're talking about a big barbarian with a sword. What is he supposed to do? Because you can't, in animation, kids animation, you can't have someone going around cutting people up with a sword. I mean, you just can't do that. So it fell to me to figure out how to make that work. And in reading one of the Robert E. Howard stories, I came across a story in which he talked about the star medal. Special medal. It came from a meteorite. And so I thought, okay, I'm gonna make that work somehow. And so I came up with Conan's sword, and all of the weapons that his friends use are made out of the star medal. And the enemy are these lizard men who can disguise themselves as human beings, but as soon as they come into contact with the star medal, it reveals who they really are, and they're sent poofing off back into this dimension that they came from. So it's completely bloodless. So you've got all these weapons that they can use, including the sword, but there's no death and there's no blood. It was like one of the most bizarre problems to have to try and figure out and make it work.
But it's still satisfying because you need that impact of the hit. The difference between G.I. Joe and Transformers is G.I. Joe would shoot guns out of each other's hands, and not necessarily satisfying, whereas on Transformers, a guy gets blasted straight square in the chest, but he's a robot, so it's okay. So that's a really...
Exactly. There were a lot of rules, very specific, hard and fast, unwritten, but specific rules for writing animation back then. And in G.I. Joe, if we blew up a plane, you had to show the bad guys safely parachuting out of that plane. Parachute. Or if you blew up a ship in the water, you had to see that people survived in the water. It was quite specific. You did not kill people.
Yeah.
And when I wrote the Ninja Turtles, again, you have live characters using martial arts weapons, and you couldn't use them directly on anybody. So I would have to have the turtle knock a branch from a tree and have the tree fall and hit somebody, or have them hit something else that would then hit somebody and knock them over. You couldn't just do direct force. It would force you to do peculiar things in order to make this work.
Yeah, and the easy thing to say is that sucks, but the tough call is to say maybe a good idea, because you don't want kids running around smashing each other in the head with nunchucks.
Well, that was exactly it. That's what they were terrified of. They called it imitatable behavior, and they were terribly afraid of kids poking one another's eyes out and doing damage to one another because they were imitating something they saw on television.
Yeah. Well, I just love hearing that when you were writing Conan, you wanted to be true to the source material. That must be nice. You know, I wish that that had been shown to your you know, your creation, or as you say, what you contributed to creating. I see that on IMDb that there is a short coming out. It's in post-production called Truly Outrageous, and you're credited as the writer.
No.
You don't have any...
I'm not writing a short. There are some fans
Yeah.
putting together some kind of a short fan movie and have been working on it, and they have been in touch with me, but I'm not writing anything.
Okay, so they're honoring you by giving you a writing credit. It's very similar to Gene Roddenberry. If you check his IMDb, you'll see that he's still writing away, and a lot of this stuff is just fan films. They're fan films, and they're crediting Gene on it. So he's still going strong. You know, he's busier than ever.
All right, there you go.
But what are you working on these days, or are you just exhausted and enjoying your downtime?
Well, I spent 6 years at Zynga, the game company, and as a narrative designer and a principal game designer there. So I worked on a number of different games at that company and a number of mobile games. And I was there trying to bring more story and more storytelling to their games, and it just wasn't working. So I finally left last April, and I've been pretty much kicking back since then. Of course, we also bought a house and moved, and that was a big deal. But a number of years ago, I wrote a book on how to write. It was called Writing for Animation, Comics, and Games, pretty much a craft guide on how to write in those three different forms of media. And the publisher's been after me to do a second edition, so that's what I'm currently working on. In fact, I'm in the middle of rewriting the animation chapters right now to bring them up to date. And then I have to do the comics chapters and the games chapters. So that's my current project. And then as soon as that's done, I'm going to get back to a project I had begun before the live-action movie. I was actually kind of hoping to have it done in sync with the live-action movie, but there was no chance of that happening. So it's a gem memoir. One very clever fan referred to it as the Gemoir, so that's what I've been calling it.
That's
and it's basically going to be how I became a writer, my career, and how I became a writer up to and through the creation of and development of the Gem series.
Wonderful. And I'll include a link to your website too, so that fans can stay up to date on all of the stuff that you're working on.
Cool.
So you've also worked, you mentioned, in games as well as comics. Do you want to touch on some of your experiences there? You mentioned you're a huge comic fan growing up. What are some of the comics you got to work on?
Well, I started out working on Conan and Red Sonja comics. Interestingly enough, that was when I broke in. That was how I first broke in as a writer. Even before I wrote animation, I was able to write some comic stuff, which was the great thrill of my life. I was able to create my own original animation and creator-owned animation series called The Sisterhood of Steel, which was published by a branch of Marvel at the time called Epic Comics. And those were creator-owned books, as I said. And so I loved doing The Sisterhood of Steel because it gave me a chance to explore how I thought a warrior sisterhood could actually function. You know, a real world of women as warriors in their society and what that would be like. And so I really loved doing that. And I got to work with Wendy Pini on ELFQUEST, which was another great thrill because I absolutely adored ELFQUEST since the very, very beginning of that series. And Wendy and I have become friends, and she's just absolutely one of the great people of the universe. So I got a chance to do a graphic novel called Wolf Rider, working with Wendy on that. And then I wrote some stuff for DC too, a few years back. I got to talk about reboots. I got to do a reboot of an 80s comic book called Amethyst, Princess of Gem World, interestingly. And that was interesting because I wanted to reboot it to, bring it up to date. But I was familiar with the original books, and so, I went back to the original books, of course, and tried to pull as many of those elements as I could. But at the same time, I wanted to give it my own spin and make it my own thing. So that ran for a while, and then I did Birds of Prey for a while, and then I did a couple of Green Arrow books that were part of this Confluence storyline that they did. So that was fun. I enjoyed doing that stuff with DC.
Oh, that's fantastic. I love to hear that you're still writing away. You're still being creative. You know, some of my favorite writers back in the day, they just seemed to write themselves out. They got burned out. John Carpenter was a big one. It just seems as though one day he decided, I think I've done enough. I'm just going to sit here and smoke. But I love hearing, you know, that these writers that I grew up watching all of their great work are still prolific, still working away. And
but I still love comics, and I still love writing for comics, and want to continue doing that. I'm at the stage of my career, though, where maybe with some exceptions, I don't mind writing, like, say, for DC, and I wouldn't mind writing, say, for Marvel, because I love those characters, and it's an understood thing when you're working with someone else's IP. But I've already turned down what could have been quite a very good job doing a story-driven video game series, similar to the Episodes and Choices story-driven games that are out there. Games being maybe not quite the right designation for them, but
like RPG.
But I would have been doing all of this completely original creative work and not owning any of it. It would have been owned by some company in South Korea. And I've just reached that stage of my career where it's like, I'm just not going to do that anymore. I am sick of putting all of my creative work and energy and time into something that somebody else owns. So my directive at this point, with the exception of something like working on IP that I like, an established IP, like say the DC characters, I want to own my stuff. So that is what has become important to me. So whatever I put on from now on, and I haven't done any novels yet. All my life I wanted to write novels. Yeah. So this is really what I think I would like to focus on in the next few years, is getting some novels out there.
In terms of going forward, I'm really interested to see what you're going to be working on next. I'm hoping, I'm really happy to hear that you're still passionate about Gem too. It's always great to hear when someone who works.
There are ways to still do that, you see.
To honor it.
So there are ways that I could probably write that love letter to the Gem fans, but just write it as my own thing.
and I think you did with the new movie, just by appearing in it, because that's you giving your blessing to it, saying, you know, I'm still here, I'm still part of this, and that's important for people, that they can love a property, but they want the original people who were responsible for it to be involved as well. People love it when Mark Hamill is into this Star Wars stuff, you know, or he makes an effort. Same with Shatner with Trek. So I just think it's wonderful that all of those original 80s Gem girls, you know, if they ever do meet you or Samantha at a convention, that it's great that, you know, you're still a fan of what you worked on.
And speaking of which, the next GemCon, the next Gem convention, is in Cleveland in the end of August, and I will be there.
Awesome. So all you Gem fans out there, definitely check that out. And Christy, I want to thank you so much. Once again, just like with Buzz, I thought this was going to be a quick chat, but here we go. We're coming up on an hour now of just shooting the breeze about, you know, all of the great shows from the 80s and beyond. So, you know, just personally, I want to thank you for the fantastic work that you did on all of the shows that shaped who I am. And I'm sure I speak for a lot of the listeners too. So thank you so much.
Absolutely, and stay outrageous.
Awesome. Thanks everyone for listening. Remember to check out ChristyMarx.com to keep up to date on what Christy's working on. If you're a Gem girl or guy, check out the upcoming GemCon in Cleveland, Ohio from August 24th to 26th. And for you collectors with truly outrageous bank accounts, check out the Gem Collectors series by Integrity Toys. Thanks again to Eric Lutz from the Patreon tribe for getting me in touch with Christy, and thanks to Christy for taking the time to chat with me and all of you. Got a Gem memory? Scroll down and go to town. And to join the tribe, hit subscribe. Show's over, Synergy.